Hi, welcome to today's video. My name is Paul. So this week I'm going to talk a little bit about Impressionism and how Impressionism has influenced my watercolor landscape painting. My watercolor landscapes are influenced by three different things. Impressionism is one of them. And one of the main points I want to make in this video is the difference between being inspired by something and copying something. So I'm not copying Impressionism as such. I'm not trying to reproduce it. First of all, the Impressionists used predominantly oil paint. Some of them, like Degas, use soft pastels, but I'm using watercolor paint. So I'm not trying to reproduce Impressionism. I'm being inspired by it. Before we get into Impressionism, at the end of the video I will show a little sort of demo video of me doing some painting. But before we get there, just a couple of minutes explaining Impressionism and the effect that Impressionism had on the Western art world. I say Western art world, we're talking mainly about France here. France, Paris was the center of Western art world really, and Impressionism was a French art movement. There were a few other people from a few other countries, but it was predominantly a French art movement. So the French art world at that time, when we're talking about 19th century, was dominated by the salon. This is the annual exhibition organized by the Academy of Fine Arts, and it was sponsored, at least in part, by the government. So it was very much an establishment thing. It's very conservative in its ideas. The salon, the exhibition, was, if you wanted to be a professional artist in France, certainly in the first half of the 19th century, you had to get your paintings approved and entered into the annual exhibition. Otherwise, you were just a nobody, an amateur painter, certainly not a professional. So it had a huge influence, and it was very restrictive because they only allowed certain styles of paintings and they only allowed certain subject matter as well. So it was very restrictive, very exclusive art world. In part sponsored by the government, so part of the overall establishment of the state as well. So that's the sort of world that it was. And the type of art they were looking for was, for example, the painting that you can see on screen. It was very rendered, very professional, very technical style of art. To me, this style of art, I have absolutely no interest in this whatsoever. It's not that I hate it, I just have no interest in it. It doesn't do anything for me. I wouldn't hang this painting in my living room, for example. There's just no way. The subject matter means nothing to me, and the art style itself, although, as I say, I can recognize the technical skill, it's just not interesting for me. Around about 1840-ish, some younger artists in France were quietly being slightly subversive. They were doing art that wasn't approved by the jury of the salon. A couple of these artists, Millet and Courbet, for example, they're often labelled nowadays as realist painters. Now, their style of painting was still very much like this painting you can see on screen. It was their subject matter that they kind of changed. So the subject matter that was approved by the salon jury was, for example, biblical scenes, historical scenes, Greek and Roman mythology, important people within the church, within the state establishment, that kind of thing. Those were the subjects that were deemed worthy of painting. The realists wanted to paint ordinary people in ordinary situations. To us, this doesn't seem very radical, but at that time it was very subversive, very radical. An example, I think this is by Millet, but don't quote me on that. But the style of painting is a realist painting. So it's just a peasant woman making bread. I say, to us it doesn't seem very radical, but at the time it was. It challenged what the establishment said was worthy of painting. Another example, this one is by Courbet. So two men breaking rocks, I guess making gravel, perhaps they're going to build a road or something, but they're obviously working class men. If you look at their clothes, they're all ripped and torn and tattered, old shoes, etc. These were not aristocrats. These were not senior members of the church or anything like that. So realism was the first challenge really to the whole establishment and the salon, the annual exhibition. Impressionists were certainly influenced by this and by this realist movement. And you can see that in some Impressionist art and their choice of subjects. Even, for example, landscape painting for the Academy of Fine Arts and the salon, the jury, was not worthy painting. It was not a serious painting style. It was all about figure painting. So of course you could use landscapes as backgrounds, but you couldn't actually create a finished painting as a landscape. That would just be silly. It was not a worthy subject. So again, I say, very restrictive ideas about what art was considered serious and good, and everything else that was just amateur or worthless or whatever. So go on a few decades, we're heading towards the end of the 1800s, about 1870 or so. A group of young artists, mostly young artists, formed a society. So this society, it was the Anonymous Society of Painters, Sculptors, Printmakers, Engravers. It had a long name, but it was basically just a group of individual artists. They had no manifesto, so people were free to paint whatever they wanted in whatever style they wanted, and the idea was that each person would pay a small subscription fee, a small entry fee to get into the society. They would use that money, they would pull it together, and they would use it to rent out some studio space, and then they could organize their own exhibition. So they were stepping away from the establishment and the established art world, and they were going to put on their own exhibition. And there was no jury, and there was no selection process, just anybody who could afford the modest entry fee could join this group and display whatever art they wanted to. One of the paintings that was exhibited in that first exhibition, you can see on screen, and this is by Claude Monet, and he called this Impression Sunrise. One of the art critics who went to this exhibition and was not impressed with the style of art, or the quality, in his opinion, of the art in the exhibition, took the name of this painting and applied it to all the paintings, and he called it the Impressionist exhibition. He did not mean that in a positive way. It was he was being insulting, basically, putting them down. But the name stuck, and eventually the artists themselves sort of took it on as a badge of whatever, rebellion or whatever, and they became known as the Impressionist exhibitions, and the artists who took part became known as the Impressionist artists. But the important thing is there was no manifesto, so these artists were all doing their own thing. They were all very different, most of them anyway. So if you look at some of the people who took part in that exhibition, Degas, for example, Cézanne, people like Alfred Sisley, they were all doing very, very, very different types of art. Their style of art had nothing in common, really, other than that they were all part of this initial exhibition. So the point I'm trying to make is the term Impressionism is not entirely meaningless, but it doesn't, some of the artists who are labeled as Impressionists have very, very different styles of art. So it's not related to the actual artwork. It's more just the fact that these artists were part of this society and they were organizing their own exhibition. Now within that larger group of artists, there were a few artists, Claude Monet, Renoir, Alfred Sisley and so on, who did spend more time together. They did exchange ideas. They went out of the city and painted together from time to time, especially in the early days. So there was a small group of artists within the overall exhibition who were developing their own style. And this Impressionist style was loose brushwork, very spontaneous paintings. They were influenced by realism, so they were painting real people in real situations. They also wanted to do just landscapes, painting just landscapes. Another art movement from a few years before them was naturalism. Naturalism and realism are very closely related, but realism is more about the subject matter, whereas naturalism is more about the style of painting. It's about capturing the natural world, the way the light interacts with the environment, for example, the use of perspective and values and colors. Their goal was to create natural-looking landscapes and paintings, hence the name, naturalism. Again, they influenced Impressionism. Impressionism kind of was a form of naturalism. The Impressionist artists, this smaller group, Monet, Renoir, Sisley, they went out and they were interested in painting the landscape and how the light interacted with the landscape and how different weather conditions, different times of day, etc., could change the landscape or the buildings or whatever it was that they were painting. For me, I'm not really interested in any of that. So when I say I'm influenced by Impressionism, it's not really that sort of side of Impressionism that interests me. It's more the individualism, we're not going to accept the way that the art world works, and we're going to do our own thing. We're going to organize our own exhibitions and just be independent artists. That's the first thing that influences me from the Impressionists. The second thing is a lot of people don't like Impressionism, or at least some people don't. They describe it as sloppy and slapdash and careless, and it is very often loose brushwork and painted quite rapidly. So a lot of people don't like that. They prefer the much more rendered style of painting. But for me, it's that sort of spontaneity and looseness and the unfinished sort of aspect of some Impressionist paintings. That's what appeals to me. And that's what I'm trying to reproduce in my watercolor landscapes. So for example, this is a watercolor painting from a couple of years ago. This is one of the first ones I did in this sort of style, trying to learn from Impressionism and trying to reproduce some of those elements of Impressionism. Like I say, not copying the Impressionist style, but being inspired by it. Another example, again, trying to get this spontaneous and unfinished look. So a lot of my landscapes have lots of white space, just white paper left. I'm not trying to be very careful. I'm not trying to reproduce a landscape exactly. All of these paintings are done from imagination. So there's no references. I'm not going outdoors to paint them. I'm a bit like Degas in that sense. Degas said that painting is not a sport, and he never saw why it was necessary to go outside to paint. I'm kind of like that myself. Sometimes, yes, and when I was younger, I did enjoy it. These days, sort of mobility problems and things, it's not as easy for me to get outside into fields and things, so I tend to work from imagination and memory instead. And then one final example. So, basic idea, I'm taking this idea of spontaneity and simplicity and an unfinished look, trying to create something that's more lively, trying to capture the feeling of space and light in the landscape as well. That's what I'm getting from Impressionism. So it's not reproducing Impressionism, it's being inspired by it and doing my own thing. And I think that's a good thing to do, and it's something I would advise artists to do. By all means, have favorite artists and art movements, but don't think that you have to copy them exactly. You have to do your own thing. That's what art's all about, I think. But you can certainly be inspired by other people. So next thing, we'll do a quick sort of demo video, just me painting one of these paintings. I should say it's very short because most of these paintings only take a couple of minutes to paint. Okay, so this painting, first thing I do is I spray some water, just clean water onto the paper, so the paper is quite damp, especially the top half of the paper. I want to paint wet in wet for the sky. I want some soft edges in the sky. I use just one brush, using French ultramarine blue. Just put some blue paint down onto the paper. I then use, as you can see me doing here, some tissue paper, Kleenex paper if you prefer, just to lift off some of that blue paint. I'm just playing with the white paper, showing some of that white paper again, and just creating a feeling of a sky and clouds in the sky. So it's not painting a sky, it's suggesting a sky, creating the impression of a sky. I then use some darker blue or indigo to put in a horizon line and some field boundaries. These are just going to be fields. And then in this case I chose sort of, I guess, complementary color scheme. So I'm using some orange with the blue. This orange, I'm using Sennelier paint, and this orange is actually called cadmium yellow deep. But as you can see, it's more of an orange than a yellow. And as I said before, there's no references. This is just imagination and keeping the composition and everything very simple. The paper itself is not very big. It's quite a small piece of paper, sort of A5 size. I'm not sure what that is in American, US measurements, but it's not a very big piece of paper. The other thing I would say is I don't really go for color mixing. Mostly the colors that I'm using are straight out of the tube, so again that speeds things up, keeps things simple. It also avoids sort of muddy colors if you're using just the pure color. And as I say, I'm not a realist painter, or a naturalist painter, so I'm not interested in trying to recreate the actual colors that you would see in the real world. I'm creating a somewhat abstract impression of reality. So it's still representational art, it's still a landscape painting, but it's not attempting to be a realistic painting. So sum up, by all means be inspired by other artists and art movements, but don't feel as though you have to reproduce their art exactly. You can be inspired by them and do your own thing. There are some links and things in the description box below to some blog articles and other resources that might be useful or interesting to some people. There's a link, for example, to my Patreon page. You can join free or part of the paid subscription. Paid subscribers gets extra videos every week. Free members get access to the slightly more random posts that I put up, showing the sort of art that I'm producing that day or that week. Free members on Patreon also get access to the YouTube video on the Friday, a day early, and of course on Patreon it's ad-free, so you don't have to sit through any advertisements before you can watch the video. So it's there if anybody's interested. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching and listening, and hopefully see you again in next week's video.